The chain around her wrist had been there so long that the skin beneath it had changed color. Saren did not think about it anymore, or at least she told herself she did not. She had learned that trick early, the trick of not looking at the things that could not be changed. The collar her mother had worn before her, the mark on the inside of her left forearm, 3 horizontal lines burned into the skin in her 7th year, the mark of the Omega servant class, the mark that said she belonged to the Ironhold pack, the way a door belonged to its frame. She had learned not to look at that either. Instead, she looked at her hands when she worked, or at the floor, or at the narrow strip of sky she could see through the high window of the beast's chamber. And she did what was required. What was required on the morning everything changed was this. She carried a wooden pail of water across the stone corridor that separated the servant quarters from the reinforced iron door at the end of the east wing. And she did not spill it, because spilling meant a second trip, and a second trip meant she would be late for the feeding, and being late for the feeding meant the overseer's rod across the backs of her knees. She had learned all of this through repetition, the way water learns the shape of stone, slowly and without forgiveness. The iron door was bolted from the outside with 3 separate locks, each of them requiring a different key, and Saren carried all 3 on a ring at her belt, because there was no one else left who would. That was the plain fact of her situation. The guards had stopped rotating 6 weeks ago, when the beast inside the chamber had taken the arm of a soldier named Brennan. Not maliciously, the senior healer had said afterward, more in the way a drowning man grabs at whatever is nearest. But the arm was gone and Brennan was gone, and one by one the guards had found reasons not to take the posting at the end of the east wing until the posting had fallen, by default and by silence, to the Omega servant who was already assigned to the chamber's maintenance. Nobody had formally given her the keys. One morning they were simply on the ring with her other keys, and no one looked at her when she went to the overseer with questions, and eventually she understood that this was how the pack made decisions about Omegas. Not with cruelty exactly, but with absence, with looking away. She unlocked the first bolt. Inside, she could hear him. Not screaming. The beast did not scream. Had not screamed in the weeks she had been his primary keeper. What she heard was movement. And it was the particular quality of the movement that told her things, the way she had learned to read the quality of wind coming under the door before a storm. Tonight the movement was slow and dragging, which meant he was in the deeper form, the one the healers called the locked shift, where the body could not complete its change back to the man shape, where he was neither wolf nor person, but something stretched painfully between, a shape with too many joints and not enough skin and eyes that were amber all the way through without any white. She had been afraid of him once. She was precise about that in her own memory. She had been afraid for exactly 3 weeks, and then one morning she had come in with the water and the food, and he had been pressed against the far wall with his enormous misaligned body curled inward, and she had seen something in the set of his shoulders that she recognized, and the fear had not gone away entirely, but something else had arrived alongside it that was bigger, and the fear had gotten quiet. She unlocked the second bolt. What she had recognized in his shoulders was the effort of trying not to take up too much space. She knew that effort intimately. She had been practicing it since she was 7 years old. The third bolt was stiff today. The cold, she thought, the deepening autumn working its way into the metal, the way it worked into her own joints on bad mornings. She worked the key with both hands, the pail of water balanced against her hip, and the lock gave with a sound like something exhaling. The door swung inward. The smell hit her first, always. Not bad. Not the rot smell the other servants spoke of in frightened whispers when they thought she could not hear, but dense, layered. The smell of something enormous and alive that had been in a closed space for too long. Animal warmth. The particular mineral quality of stone that has absorbed years of body heat. And underneath that, something Saren had never been able to name, something resinous and dark that she had eventually decided, was just the smell of that much magic concentrated in one place. He was in the corner where she expected him. The locked shift body was folded against the stones in a way that looked uncomfortable even from across the room. Limbs at angles that did not correspond to any natural resting position. The great hunched back rising and falling with each labored breath. In the torchlight his fur was the color of old iron, gray-black with threads of silver at the ruff, and she could see the places where the shift lock had been doing its damage. The skin at the joints where fur gave way to flesh pulled too tight, too thin, showing the dark tracery of veins beneath. Saren set the pail down and latched the door behind her, which was protocol. Keep the door latched. Never let it swing free, because an open door was an invitation to the wrong kind of hope. and hope in a locked-shift beast could be dangerous. Then she moved to the stone shelf along the east wall and began the morning routine, the one she had built herself, because there had been no instructions when the keys appeared on her ring, no manual for the care of a cursed alpha, in a condition no healer fully understood. She had simply started paying attention and built the routine out of what she noticed. Water first, not offered from across the room, which she had tried in the beginning and which he would not take. She had learned that he needed the water to be set within reach, and then for her to step back, to give him the span of several feet, to make it clear that her presence was not a transaction. She understood that too. When she was first assigned to the kitchens at the age of 9, the cook had made her stand and watch as the others ate before she was permitted a bowl, and she had learned to associate the proximity of food and water with the presence of someone who held power over her access to it. The beast had learned something similar, though she did not know where or when or how. So she set the water within his reach and stepped back, and she moved to the food next. The raw meat that she collected each morning from the pack kitchen, which was another thing no one looked at when she came to collect it. Another thing accomplished by absence and looking away. She arranged the meat on the flat stones she had designated for the purpose. And then she moved to the furthest point in the room and she sat down on the low bench she had brought in herself, carrying it on her back through the corridor because she had been tired of sitting on the floor. And she waited. This was the part that the other servants found most incomprehensible when she had tried to explain it, once, to a woman named Dara who had asked why she didn't just set the food and leave immediately. The waiting was the work, Saren had said. The waiting was the whole point. And Dara had looked at her with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and alarm, and had not asked again. The beast moved after a while. She did not track the time exactly, had learned that tracking time in this room only made the waiting feel like an imposition, which would make her body language wrong, which he would notice, because he noticed everything despite the shift lock. Perhaps because of it, the great head turned, the amber eyes found her in the dimness, and she met them the way she always did, directly and without the flinch that she had spent weeks training out of herself. He moved to the water. She watched him drink without watching him, which was a skill she had developed out of respect for whatever privacy was left to him in that room, in that body. She could track the sounds, the water sounds, the sounds of the meat being taken, while keeping her gaze at a middle distance, focused on the wall above his head. "It is cold this morning," she said, not for any particular reason. She had started talking in this room about 4 weeks ago, low and consistent, not filling the silence so much as acknowledging that there were 2 living creatures in it. She talked about the weather, about the state of the kitchen garden she passed on her way through the courtyard, about small and ordinary things that required nothing from him. She did not expect responses, and she did not perform the sentences in the way that people performed sentences when they were hoping for something. What happened next was not a sound she had heard before. It was low, and it came from the corner, and it was not the drag of the locked shift body repositioning itself on the stones. It was something more deliberate than that, more shaped. She went still the way a person goes still when they hear something they are not sure they heard. The held breath stillness of possible meaning. It came again. She could not have said whether it was a word. It had the architecture of a word, the sense of intention behind it, the sense of something being aimed at something else. But the lock-shift throat was not built for language, and what emerged was compressed and rough, and she had to hold it in her mind for a long moment before she could parse it. Cold. He had said cold. Saren sat with that for several seconds, 5 seconds perhaps, maybe 8. The bench was hard against the backs of her thighs, and the torch in the wall sconce was burning lower, and the amber eyes across the room were watching her with an attention that was almost formal. "Yes," she said, "it is cold." She could not name what passed through her in that moment, which frustrated her. She was a practical person and she believed in naming things accurately. It was a habit born of a life in which imprecision was punished. What she felt was not surprise exactly, because she had suspected for some time that the intelligence behind those amber eyes was whole and present and suffering the same isolation she suffered, just from a different angle. It was not joy either, though something adjacent to it moved through her, like the first warm air through a door cracked open. It was something more like recognition, like the moment you have been a long time alone in a room, and a light goes on in the window of the house across the way, not near enough for warmth, but proof at least that the darkness is not absolute. She reached up and unclasped the heavy shawl from her shoulders. It was her own, brought from her room that morning, gray wool, worn at the edges but still thick. And she crossed the room and set it just inside his reach the same way she had learned to set the water. Then she returned to her bench. After a moment the great clawed hand, more hand than paw, in the locked shift the fingers present and articulate but wrong in their proportions, too long, too thick-knuckled, moved to the shawl and gathered it against the broad chest, not pulling it around himself in any human gesture, but holding it, the way an animal holds something that has a reassuring smell. Saren looked at the strip of sky in the high window. The light was coming up, gray-pink at the edges, the particular color of early autumn mornings at this latitude. Outside in the pack compound, she knew the morning routines were beginning, the training yards filling, the kitchens waking, the day's hierarchy organizing itself in all the small 1,000 ways it always did. Alpha Cassian would be in the great hall by now, receiving the first reports of the day. The pack council would be assembling. None of them would be thinking about the East Wing. None of them had thought about it in weeks, which was, she had come to understand, the entire architecture of their relationship to what lived inside this room. They were waiting for him to die, she thought, without quite permitting themselves to think they were waiting for him to die. They had put him here because the curse had made him something they did not know how to govern. He had been the pack's most powerful warrior once. She had gathered that from fragments and silences, from the way people dropped their voices when they mentioned his name, and they had locked him away and delegated his care to an Omega servant, and they were waiting for the problem to resolve itself. His name was Dorian. She had found that out the same way she found out most things, by being invisible in the right places, by being the kind of person that other people forgot was in the room. Two of the healers, speaking to each other in the corridor outside the chamber, had used his name in the flat, practical way of people discussing a medical case, and she had carried the name back into the room with her and said it aloud that evening, tentatively. The way you might lay down a card in a game you were not sure you understood. He had gone very still when she said it. And then the amber eyes had found her with an intensity that was different from his usual watchfulness, something fiercer and less comfortable in it. And she had wondered if she had made an error, but he had not moved toward her. He had simply looked at her with that fierce, unsettled attention for a long moment, and then looked away, and she had decided she had not made an error. She had decided she had done the right thing, which was simply, she had said his name. She had told him that she knew he had one. She had told him she knew he was a person. That had been 11 days ago. Since then, in small and incremental ways, things had been different. On the 4th day after, he had moved closer to her bench than he had ever been during a waking period. Not close, still 8 or 9 feet, but closer, which she had noted without commenting on. On the 7th day he had, while she was talking about the kitchen garden, made a sound that she was fairly certain was an attempt at a word. She had not been sure what word, and had continued talking, choosing to normalize the attempt rather than drawing attention to it. And, in the days since then, the attempts had come more frequently. This morning, cold, she sat on her bench and watched the light change in the high window and thought about the shawl bundled against his chest and thought about his voice attempting the shape of that word. And something in her was careful and attentive, in a way she could not entirely account for. She did not let herself think about what she was feeling. Not yet. That seemed like a thing that needed to wait for a quieter moment, which was not a moment she could predict the arrival of. She did her work and went back to the servant quarters when the morning allocation was done. And she thought about him while she did the other tasks of her day. And that evening, she went back with the second feeding and the fresh water and the clean straw she brought twice weekly, and this time he was closer to the lock shift body's standing height, which was wrong and ungainly, but represented an attempt at it. And the amber eyes were brighter than they had been in weeks. 3 days later, she was summoned to the Pack Council. She had never been summoned to the Pack Council. She knew people who had, and none of them described it as a comfortable experience. The Pack Council met in the Great Hall, at the long table of pale stone with the iron rings set into the top of it. She had cleaned those rings herself, many times, their purpose unstated and self-evident, and Alpha Cassian sat at its head and the 5 sub-alphas flanked him, and the architecture of the room was designed to make you feel, when you stood before them, like something that had been brought in from outside for examination. She stood before them now. The chain at her wrist was visible, as it always was, below the cuff of her work dress. She had not been told why she was summoned, but she had been told by the overseer to come clean and to speak only when addressed, which meant something was being decided about her. Alpha Cassian was a large man in his 50s with a deliberate stillness about him, the kind of stillness that accumulates in people who have held power for a long time and have stopped needing to perform it. He looked at her across the length of the stone table, and she looked back, keeping her face even. "You are the keeper of the Eastern Chamber," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Alpha." Creature's condition, creature. She felt that word settle into her the way a cold thing settles, not painfully but making itself known. She kept her face even. "He is alive," she said. "He takes water and food regularly. He is responsive. The locked shift condition appears stable, though I am not a healer and I cannot speak to its deeper mechanics." A silence at the table. The sub-alphas were looking at her, with a variety of expressions. Some flat and professional, one or two with the particular quality of discomfort that she recognized as people who would prefer not to be having this conversation. "Stable," the alpha repeated. "Yes, Alpha. The healer's last reported deterioration. That was 6 weeks ago," she said carefully. "Before I became the primary keeper." Another silence. She could see Cassian considering her, reassessing something. She held still and let him do it. "The council has been reviewing the situation," he said. "The curse on Dorian Ashvale was placed by the Thornwood Coven in retribution for actions taken during the Border War. We have made inquiries. The Coven has indicated that the curse cannot be broken except by specific conditions." He paused. "One of those conditions involves the cursed individual forming a voluntarily sustained bond with someone who serves without resentment." Saren waited. She was good at waiting. "The Council's assessment," Cassian said, "is that the Eastern Chamber is a resource being expended without return. We cannot continue to maintain a warrior of Ashvale's rank in a state of indefinite incapacity. The Thornwood Coven's condition is difficult to verify, and we are not confident it can be met." She heard the sentence before he said it. She had always been good at that. "We are transferring the keeper duties to the institutional healer's ward," he said. "The chamber will be repurposed. The creature, Ashvale, will be processed through the standard end-of-care protocol." End-of-care protocol. She knew those words. They were the words the pack used for animals too injured to save. They were the words they used for Omegas, who had become a net cost. They were clean words for an unclean thing when, she said. Cassian's eyes moved to her with a new quality in them. The slight attention of a man noticing that a chair has moved. 3 days. "I would like to speak to the council regarding the curse condition," she said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence. She felt it in the air, the adjustment of everyone in the room to the fact that she had said what she had just said. Sub-Alpha Farron, to the right of Cassian, looked at her the way you look at something small that has made an unexpectedly loud sound. "You are a keeper," Cassian said. "Yes, Alpha. And the keeper is the person with the most current and direct information about the cursed individual's condition. If the council is making a decision about the curse's conditions, my information is relevant." Another silence. Longer this time. Cassian looked at her for a moment that stretched. Then he said, "Speak." She had 3 minutes, she judged, before the weight of the room would shift against her, and she would lose whatever ground she had. So she was precise. She told them about the water, about the 11 days since she had said his name, about the morning's single word, and the trajectory of what she had seen, and her assessment, careful, never overclaiming, that the locked shift was not deteriorating, but had in fact stabilized and shown minor signs of regression in the 6 weeks of her keepership. She told them about the shawl. Because it was evidence of behavior, the healer's deterioration report would not have predicted. An injured animal in terminal decline did not gather a scarf against its chest. An injured creature approaching the end did not attempt language. She told them, because she had nothing to lose by telling them, that the Coven's condition, as stated by the Alpha, a voluntarily sustained bond with someone who serves without resentment, appeared to her, based on what she had observed, to be in process of formation. She was aware that this was a claim that could be used against her in ways she did not fully control. She made it anyway. "You are saying," Cassian said slowly, "that you have formed a bond with the creature in the Eastern Chamber. I am saying that the Coven's stated condition may already be partially met. I am saying that ending the keepership now may interrupt something that would otherwise resolve the Council's resource concern without requiring end of care." Farron said, "The Omega is making claims about supernatural bond formation. I am making an observation about behavioral evidence," Saren said, "that appears consistent with the condition the Coven described." Cassian looked at the table for a long moment. Then he looked at Farron, and something passed between them in the compressed language of people who have made decisions together for a long time. 7 days, Cassian said. The council extends the keepership by 7 days. If there is no material change in Ashvale's condition by then, end of care proceeds. If there is, the healer's ward will be involved in formal assessment. It was not what she had hoped for. She had hoped for more time. But she recognized the shape of it. It was the most that was available to her in that room on that day. Thank you, Alpha, she said. She left the great hall and walked back through the compound in the gray autumn light. And she let herself be afraid for the 3 minutes it took to reach the east corridor, and then she was done with it and she unlocked the first bolt and went in. He was standing. Not the wrong angled half-stance of the locked shift, not the collapsed curl of the bad mornings, but standing, imperfectly, with one shoulder lower than the other, and the proportions still wrong, and the amber eyes burning from a face that was more face than muzzle today, more man than wolf, but standing, with both feet on the floor and his head up, and the gray shawl still bundled in his too large hand. She stood in the doorway and looked at him, and he looked back. Saren, he said, her name, low and rough and imperfect, the lock-shift throat still fighting the consonants, but unmistakable. Her name, which she had not told him, which meant he had known it already, which meant he had been listening to people in the corridor for long enough to have collected it the way she collected things. Through absence, through the patience of someone who has learned to glean what they need from the margins. She closed the door behind her and walked to her bench and sat down, and she kept her voice steady when she spoke. I have 7 days, she said, to change something the Pack Council can measure. He watched her. The amber eyes were very clear today, very present. 7 days, she said, for you to show them enough that they will not proceed with end of care. End of care. She watched the words land on him, watched something in the lines of his face, which was more face today, more available, tighten and then flatten, the expressions on someone who is receiving information they already suspected, but have been carrying alone. They want me dead, he said. 3 words, and the last one blurred at the edges, but 3 words, whole and aimed. They want the problem resolved, she said. They want the resource cost to stop. They do not have the courage to want you dead explicitly, which is why they use words like end of care, but yes. She had not planned to say it that bluntly. She was not a blunt person by habit. Bluntness was a luxury, like most forms of directness, that she had not historically been permitted. But something about the room, about the quality of his attention, about the fact that he had said her name, made the oblique approach feel dishonest in a way she was unwilling to be. The coven, he said. Yes, the curse. The Alpha told me the condition today. She paused. A bond formed with someone who serves without resentment. Silence. He was still standing, which was remarkable, and which she chose not to remark on, because remarking on it would make him aware of how remarkable it was in a way that might disrupt whatever was allowing him to do it. You are not resentful, he said. It was not quite a question. She considered the honest answer, which took a moment to locate because it had some complexity to it. I am resentful, she said, of the pack, of the system that put me in this room and put you in this room, of the chain on my wrist and the mark on my arm and the fact that no one left instructions when they gave me the keys because I am the kind of person who does not require instructions in their accounting. She paused. I am not resentful of you. You have never looked away from me. He absorbed that. She watched him absorb it, watched it move through whatever internal calculus he was performing. The bond, he said. You think it is forming. I think something is forming, she said. I cannot read coven conditions. I am telling you what I observed and what I told the council. What did you observe? She was quiet for a moment. The torch was burning evenly, and the morning light through the high window was strengthening toward full day, and the room was warmer than it had been when she arrived. I observed, she said, that I stopped being afraid of you in the 3rd week, and that what I felt instead was something I could not name accurately, which I have found is usually the sign of something that does not fit in the categories I was given. She looked at her hands on her knees. I observed that when you said cold this morning, I felt something in my chest that I have not felt before, something like a door opening. He was quiet for a long time. Then he moved, not toward her, but carefully, the wrong proportioned body navigating the space with a deliberateness she recognized as someone relearning a room, and he went to the flat stones where she set his food, and he lowered himself to a sitting position, which was something she had not seen him do in the daylight hours, which meant he was choosing to be at a lesser height, which meant something she did not want to name too quickly. Tell me about the garden, he said. She blinked. The garden? The kitchen garden. You talk about it. His voice was steadier now, the words coming with more confidence, as if the attempt of them was smoothing the mechanism. I want to hear about it. She felt something release in her chest, some tension she had been holding since the Great Hall, and perhaps since much longer before that. She settled back against the wall behind her bench, and she told him about the kitchen garden, about the late cabbages that were still in, and the beds that had been turned under for winter, and the small fig tree in the corner that produced fruit every 3 years, whether you tended it or not, seemingly on its own private schedule. She told him about the gray cat that lived under the rosemary hedge and emerged at dawn to drink from the watering butt, and about how the soil near the north wall was richer than anywhere else, because it caught the kitchen runoff. She told him all of it, the small, ordinary, persistent things that kept going, regardless of the larger events arranged above them. He listened, and every few minutes, roughened and imperfect but present, his voice would arrive with a question or a fragment. Cold became "tell me more," became the quality of his attention, like something she could feel on her skin without being touched. By the time she left that evening, he had spoken 40 words. She had counted without meaning to. The second day, the shift had receded another measurable degree, the proportions closer, the face more present, the movement less compensatory. She brought him a second blanket and a whetstone she had found in the maintenance storeroom, on an instinct she could not entirely explain, except that the stone had seemed like the kind of object a warrior would want in his hands, something purposeful and familiar. He had taken it and turned it over and held it for the rest of that morning's session without using it, just held it. And she had understood that correctly. It was about having something that belonged to his former self, something that said there was a self to return to. She talked. He talked back in increasing fragments, and she did not correct the grammar or the incomplete syllables, just received what came and built her responses to meet it. They talked about the border war in careful pieces because it was important, and because she was not afraid of important things, even when they were painful. He told her, in fragments over 2 days, what the curse had done, not just the locked shift but the isolation, the severing of his bond sense for the pack, the inability to speak or be heard, the long months of being present in his own body without access to any of the channels through which a wolf communicates. 38 months. She held that number, 38 months of silence, of looking at the high window and the changing light and nothing else. I thought, he said on the 3rd day, that you were afraid and hiding it. I was, she said, for a while. And then? She looked at him. He was seated on the floor across from her bench, which was not far, which was close enough for her to see the clear amber of his eyes without the torchlight distorting it. And she said the true thing, because she had decided some time ago that truth was what she had to offer. It was the only currency she had not been stripped of. And then I saw that you were practicing the same thing I practice, she said, trying not to take up too much space. And I thought, something has hurt you into doing that. Something has made you small, and I was angry about that. Angry, he repeated. Angry on your behalf, she said, which is different. Something moved through his expression that she watched carefully, and could not fully name, but which felt important. Felt like the expression of someone receiving something they had been without for so long that they had stopped remembering they could want it. The bond, he said. I can feel it. He touched the place over his chest, a gesture that was entirely human, entirely self-aware. Not fully, but a thread of something. She had felt it too. She had felt it since the morning of cold, had felt it growing since then, a warmth in her sternum that was not metaphor. Something actual, something with a physical address, something that responded when she was close to him and quieted to a background hum when she was not. She had not said it because she was not certain of it, and she did not make claims she was not certain of. But she nodded yes, she said. A thread. On the 4th day, she brought the council's healer to the door, not into the room, but to the door. And she described what she had observed in precise clinical language, and the healer looked through the viewing slot and went back to the council, and that evening Cassian sent word that the 7 days would be extended to 14. She had felt relief but also something hard beneath it, because 14 days was still a countdown, still the pack saying, demonstrate utility or the cost is cut. She lived her whole life in that architecture, demonstrate utility, and she was tired of it, and she let herself be tired of it in the privacy of her own chest, and then went back to work. The 5th day was the day the council sent someone else, not a healer. A sub-alpha. Farron, the one who had said the Omega is making claims about supernatural bond formation, with 2 guards, and they stood in the corridor outside the locked door, and Farron said, in the flat practical voice of institutional necessity, that the council had reconsidered the timeline. A situation had developed on the northern border. Ashvale's incapacitation was now creating a security gap. The healer's report was promising but not conclusive, and the council had decided that a more expedient resolution was required. The curse breaker, Farron said, requires the bond to be tested under witnessed conditions. The Coven has agreed to send an assessor. If the bond is verified, the curse breaks and Ashvale returns to active duty. If it is not verified, end of care proceeds today. Saren pressed her back against the corridor wall and looked at Farron and thought about the thread in her chest and about cold spoken in the dark. And she thought about how she had not been consulted on any part of this decision, not the timeline, not the testing conditions, not the presence of the Coven assessor. She had bought 7 days in the Great Hall, and they had been reduced to 5, and now they were being traded away again. The same way her mother's years of service had been traded away. The same way the arm was just Brennan's arm to the pack, but had been Brennan's arm to Brennan. When, she said, this afternoon. She went back in. He knew before she said anything. She could see it in him, the way he read the quality of the air around her with a precision that had nothing to do with the locked shift, and everything to do with 38 months, of having attention as the only faculty fully available to him. What has happened, he said. Not a question, she told him. All of it, cleanly, without softening it into something more manageable. She told him about Farron in the corridor and the Coven assessor, and the 2 hours and the witness test. He was quiet for a moment that was longer than his usual pauses. Then he said, "Are you afraid?" She considered that honestly. Of the test? No. Of the outcome? Yes. Of what I will do if they proceed with end of care, regardless of the test? Yes. What will you do? She had been sitting with this question in the back of her mind since the morning of the summons, the morning in the Great Hall when she had looked at Cassian and understood what end of care meant and had felt, beneath the practical calculations, something cold and absolute and irreversible move through her. Something that had told her, this is a line, not a negotiation, a line. I will not permit it, she said. She did not elaborate, because she did not yet know the specific shape of what not permitting it would look like. And she did not make claims she could not back, but the statement itself was clean and she stood behind it. He looked at her for a long moment. The amber eyes were very clear, very present, very human in their quality. The bond, he said. It is not a thread anymore, she knew. She had felt it this morning when she unlocked the door, had felt it like a change in the quality of light in a room when a window is opened. Not bright. Nothing so simple as bright, but expanded, capable, as if the room had dimensions it had not had before. No, she said, not a thread. He rose to his feet. Still not the fully resolved man shape. There were still echoes of the locked shift in his proportions, still wrongnesses at the shoulders, still the too much of him that the curse had made. But standing and steady, and his face looking at her with an expression she was going to have to find a new category for, because the ones she had were insufficient. Tell me something, he said, about the garden, about anything. His voice was almost all his, the lock-shift roughness thinning away from it. I want to hear your voice, the way it is when you are not worried. She sat on her bench, and she talked about the fig tree that fruited every 3 years on its own schedule, not for anyone, not to be useful, just because it was a fig tree, and that was what fig trees did when left alone long enough. And she talked about the gray cat and the watering butt, and she talked about the particular quality of the morning light in autumn, at this latitude, that she had been watching through the high window for months now. And she talked without performance and without aim, and while she talked, she heard a sound she had not heard in this room before. It started low, and then it was not low. It was present, and it was warm, and it was his voice resolving through the last of the locked shift roughness into something that was fully his own, and what he was doing was answering her. Not with words this time, but with the sound below words, the sound of a wolf who has been alone for 38 months, and is no longer alone, and she felt the bond in her chest expand to meet it like a room filling with warmth from a fire finally lit. When Farron returned with the guards and the Coven assessor, a thin woman in gray who looked at everything with the impersonal attention of someone reading a text, Saren unlocked the door and stepped aside, and what she let them see was not the thing they had been coming to test. What they saw was Dorian Ashvale standing at full height in the center of the chamber, not the locked shift height, not the wrong proportioned crouch of a creature in the grip of a curse that had been crushing him for 38 months. His full height, which was considerable, which was the height of the warrior the pack's corridors remembered in their bones. Even if the pack itself had been practicing forgetting him, he was not fully resolved. There was still the last thinning of the curse at his edges, still the amber in his eyes, brighter than it would be when the change was complete, but he was standing in his own body like a person who is reclaiming a room they had been locked out of, deliberate and without apology. The Coven assessor walked around him in a slow circle, which Saren watched from the doorway with her hand still and her face even. The woman took out a small glass instrument from her coat, something Saren had never seen the name for, but which seemed to take readings of the air the way a compass takes readings of a field. And she held it near Dorian and near Saren in turn, and she looked at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Farron. The bond is present and mutual, she said, voluntarily formed. The condition is met. Farron looked at Saren in the corridor, and then looked at Dorian in the chamber, and something moved through the sub-alpha's face. That was not quite any single emotion, but an amalgam of several that were jostling for position. Among them, Saren thought, were relief and professional embarrassment, and something that was not quite shame but was adjacent to it, the expression of a person realizing they had been building arguments against the evidence for a long time. The curse, Farron said to the assessor. Breaking now, the woman said, in this brisk tone of someone reporting a weather condition. The locked shift will complete its resolution over the next 12 to 24 hours. Full shift capacity should return within 72. Farron looked at Saren again. There was a question in it that he did not ask, which he thought was typical, and also at this moment beside the point. Is the council satisfied, she said. Farron said, the council will want a full report from the assessor before making any determination of Ashvale's status. The council, Saren said, can have that report. She kept her voice even. She was very tired now, in the particular way that people get tired when they have been running on purpose and fear and the determination to see a thing through, and the thing is through. The specific heaviness of that. I would also like the council to review my own status. Farron looked at her. Your status as keeper. My status as an Omega servant of the Ironhold Pack, she said. I would like it reviewed. The chain on her wrist caught the torchlight. The 3 lines on her inner forearm were invisible beneath her sleeve, but she knew they were there, had always known, would always know. She was not speaking impulsively. She had been carrying this sentence for longer than she had been in this room, had perhaps been carrying it her entire life, had simply been waiting for a moment when she had earned enough ground to stand on, when she said it. Farron said nothing for a moment. Then, that is a matter for Alpha Cassian. Then I will bring it to Alpha Cassian, she said, when Dorian Ashvale has completed his resolution and can accompany me. The quality of silence that followed was different from the other silences of the day. It was the silence of a room in which the furniture has shifted and everyone is recalculating the space. She was aware of the guard's attention, of the assessor's impersonal watchfulness, of Farron's careful face. She was also aware of Dorian, behind her in the room, the warmth of the bond in her chest like something permanent and structural now, something load-bearing, and his attention at her back like a hand on a door, not pushing, not directing, just present. She did not look back at him. She did not need to. 2 days, Farron said finally. Cassian will schedule an audience. She inclined her head. Not gratitude, she thought. She was done performing gratitude for access to what she was owed. Simple acknowledgement. Simple receipt of a date. They left, the guards, and the assessor and Farron with his complicated face. And Saren turned and went back into the chamber and latched the door and crossed to her bench and sat down, and she was shaking. Finally, now that there was no one left to not shake in front of. Her hands were trembling on her knees, and she looked at them with the practical attention she gave everything, observing the trembling the way she observed weather. Noting it, not fighting it, letting it pass. Dorian crossed the room. Not in the locked shift drag or the compensatory lean. He moved the way she imagined he moved once, clean and purposeful, still with the last of the curse's residue at his edges, but moving through it rather than around it, the body remembering itself. He sat down on the floor beside her bench without invitation, close enough that she could feel the warmth that came off him. The specific excessive warmth of a shifter in resolution, the body burning through the last of the curse's constraints. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, You shook during the thing with Farron. I did not. Inside you did, he said. I could feel it. She looked at the chain on her wrist. Yes, she said. Inside, you hit it perfectly. I have had a great deal of practice. He was quiet. She could feel the quality of his quiet. Not empty. Not the absence of speech, but attentive gathered. The quality of someone listening for something they have decided is worth hearing. When you stood in that corridor, he said, and told him you were bringing it to Cassian, that you would bring it with me. She waited. You were not asking my permission, he said. You were telling me what was already true. Yes, she said. That is, he stopped. I do not have a word for what that is. She thought about it. About the architecture of what she had done, the specific mechanics of it. She had not asked him to advocate for her, had not positioned herself as someone requiring rescue, had stated a fact that included him as a given, as someone whose presence and capacity and choice she did not doubt, and had then moved forward on that basis. She had not performed helplessness. She had not asked permission. She had simply known and said so. I think the word might be trust, she said. Though I am aware that it sounds simple when it is not. No, he said. It is not simple. He looked at his hands, the hands that were resolving back to their proper size and proportion. The hands of a man rather than the overbuilt, wrong-angled extremities of the locked shift. 38 months, he said. I did not think. He stopped again. She waited for him to find it. I did not think there would be someone who would say my name, he said finally. Someone who would say it and mean, you are a person, not a problem, not a resource question, not end of care. He looked at her. Just, you are a person. The torch burned and the light moved in the high window, the afternoon coming to its close, the compound outside doing its ordinary business in the ordinary way of compounds that do not know what has shifted in their east wing. She thought about everything she would have to do in the next 2 days. The audience with Cassian, the review of her status, all the practical architecture of changing a thing that had been fixed for a very long time. She thought about how hard that would be, and how possible it was. Because possible and hard were not the same thing, and she had spent her life learning the difference. She also thought about the bond in her chest, which was no longer a thread, and no longer an expanding warmth, but something settled and permanent, something that had found its natural state and was resting there. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the specific quality of a thing that is exactly where it is supposed to be. She thought about cold, and about the gray shawl, and about the fig tree that fruited on its own schedule. And she thought about the way his voice had resolved that morning, coming back to itself through the last of the curse's grip. And she thought about trust, specific kind of trust that is not a surrender but a building. You are a person, she said. That is the whole thing. That is all it was. Not nothing, he said quietly. 38 months, not nothing. No, she agreed. Not nothing. Outside, the evening was coming in. She could see the strip of sky in the high window, deepening from gray to the dark blue of early night. The first stars becoming visible at its edge, very small and very cold and very far away but unambiguously present. She looked at them the way she had been looking at that strip of sky for months, but differently now. Not for the reminder that there was a world outside the room, but with something more like company. The sense that the world outside was not opposed to her but continuous. With her was the same world that held the kitchen garden, and the gray cat and the watering butt and whatever came next. In the morning she would bring water and food, and she would do all the small things she always did. And in the afternoon she would begin the work of the audience with Cassian, and she would do it without deference and without performance. And she would do it because she needed protection, but because they were going together. Because that was what they had decided, and because the pack that had been waiting for a problem to resolve itself was going to have to learn that the problem had resolved itself into something entirely different than they had planned for. They had planned for nothing, which was the plan they had always made for Omegas, for servants, for the things maintained in the East Wing on diminishing allocations while the real decisions happened elsewhere. She had spent 30 years being maintained on a diminishing allocation. She was done with that. The council would review her status. Not as a request. She had said as much to Farron, those plain words, and she would say it again to Cassian in whatever plain words were necessary. The chain on her wrist was not a fact of nature. It was a decision someone had made, and decisions could be remade, and she had bought enough ground in the last 5 days to stand on when she said so, and she was going to stand on it. Dorian shifted beside her, not the locked shift movement, not the damaged compensatory adjustment, but simply the movement of a man settling into a more comfortable position on a stone floor, the entirely ordinary movement of a body that has begun to remember how to be ordinary. He was still too warm with the resolution fever, still at the last edge of the curse's unwinding, but his breathing even, and his weight on the floor beside her was solid and real, and the bond between them was as settled as stones. She did not lean into him. Not yet. That was a conversation still ahead of them, a country with a border she had not crossed. A thing she thought about in the same careful, practical way. She thought about everything, noting what she felt and what it meant and what conditions she required. She was not afraid of what was on the other side of that border. She was, in fact, curious about it in the way she was curious about the fig tree's cycle. Not impatient, not performing desire, just genuinely interested in knowing how the thing developed when you gave it time and attention and no resentment. For now she sat on her bench in the East Wing chamber, with the torch burning, and the stars in the high window, and the bond settled in her chest like something load-bearing, and she breathed. "Tell me about tomorrow," he said. "Which part?" "The garden," he said. "Start there." She looked at the stars in the narrow window, and she thought about the late cabbages and the turned beds and the gray cat and the fig tree that fruited on its own schedule, and she began. The pack council heard them 3 days later. A day past Farron's timeline, because the resolution fever ran 22 hours, and when it broke, Dorian Ashvale stood in the East Chamber at his full and proper height with his eyes clear, and his shift fully available to him and his bond sentence for the pack returning in pieces the way sensation returns to a limb that has been compressed too long, and he had said nothing dramatic about any of it. He had simply looked at Saren with the specific quality of attention that she recognized as the way he looked at things that mattered to him, and had said, "Ready." She had brought him clean clothes from the stores. She had thought about this, had measured the problem practically, and she had brought the whetstone and the blanket and everything she had brought into that room over the months, arranged on the bench, because the things a person leaves behind in a room they are leaving tell you something about what they are leaving behind, and she wanted that room to hold nothing of what she had built in it. She took the shawl last, folded it, put it over her arm. They walked through the compound together. She was aware of the quality of attention they were attracting. It was not the attention she usually attracted, the inattention that was the specific social technology applied to Omegas, the looking away. This was attention of a different kind. People stopping, people turning, people noting the sub-alpha who had been in the East Wing for 38 months and had been discussed in the flat clinical language of a resource question, and finding him not dead and not diminished and moving through the compound with a stillness and an amplitude that was the specific quality of a person who has had everything stripped from them and has decided that the stripping is over. And beside him the Omega Keeper, the chain on her wrist, her hands steady. In the great hall she said what she had to say. She did not ask. She did not perform gratitude. She laid out the facts, the 5 days, the bond, the assessor's report, the 30 years of her own service under the Omega designation, in the same clean specific language she had used in the corridor with Farron, and she said, "The designation is a decision, not a fact of nature, and I am asking the council to remake it." Cassian looked at her for a long moment, and then looked at Dorian, and then looked at the stone table with its iron rings, and something in the architecture of the room was different from when she had stood in it before. And she knew what was different. Last time she had stood alone, and this time she did not. And the difference was not that she needed protection, but that what she was refusing could no longer be dismissed as the request of a thing with no standing. "The Omega designation," Cassian said slowly, "is governed by the pack charter. The pack charter," Saren said, "can be amended. Charters are amended when the conditions that generated them no longer apply. The condition that generated my designation was my mother's designation, which was her mother's. I am asking the council to consider whether a designation inherited through 3 generations without review is a designation or a habit." The silence in the great hall was the silence of people sitting with a true thing. Cassian looked at Dorian. "You attest to the bond?" "I attest to it," Dorian said. His voice in the great hall, in the open air of it, without the East Wing stone around it, had a quality she had not heard before. Full and certain, the voice of someone occupying his authority again. The 38 months of silence making what came after it more deliberate, more weighted. "And you understand," Cassian said to Saren, "what the dissolution of an Omega designation involves. The bond with Ashvale is a complicating factor." "The bond with Ashvale," she said, "is not a complication. It is a fact. I am not asking the council to dissolve my designation because of the bond. I am asking the council to dissolve my designation because it should have been reviewed 3 generations ago. And it was not. And I am the one standing here today making the request." Cassian looked at the table. He looked at Farron. He looked at the other sub-alphas, and she watched the calculation moving through all of them, the assessment of cost and utility, and the very specific calculation of a pack that had just learned that its most powerful dormant asset had been kept alive and functional by the person they had been most systematically ignoring, and what it meant to refuse that person's request now in this hall, with their most powerful dormant asset standing beside her. It was not a heroic calculation. She did not require it to be. She required only that it land in the right place. "The council," Cassian said, "will review the Omega designation protocols at the next formal session." Pending that review, Saren of the Keeper's role will be designated provisional free status. It was not everything. She had known it would not be everything today. Provisional free status was not dissolution, was not the full thing, was still a hedge, still the pack's characteristic way of making a change, while looking like it was not quite making a change. But it was the First Amendment in 3 generations. And she had made it happen herself in the Great Hall, with her hands steady and her chain on her wrist and the bond in her chest like something load-bearing, not by asking for rescue and not by being rescued, but by standing in the room where decisions were made and refusing, with specificity and patience and the evidence of her own 5 days, to be left out of the accounting. She inclined her head to Cassian, the same acknowledgement she had given Farron in the corridor, not gratitude, just receipt. Then she and Dorian walked out of the great hall together into the compound under the autumn sky, and the light was the particular gold of late afternoon, everything slanted and warm and precise the way autumn light is, making the world look like something worth seeing. And she looked at it for a moment with the same attention she gave everything, noting the color and the angle of it, and how the kitchen garden would look in it, and she thought about the provisional and the not yet and all the work still ahead. Then she looked at the chain on her wrist and she thought, provisional free status does not come with a key to this lock, and I will need to determine who holds that key, and I will need to ask for it, or ask for a tool, or find another way, but I will do it on the schedule I choose and no one else's. The fig tree, Dorian said beside her. She looked up. What? You said it fruits every 3 years on its own schedule. He was looking across the compound toward where she had described the kitchen garden, the direction of it, if not the sight of it from here. I want to see it. She looked at him, at the clear amber-threaded eyes, and the stillness of a person who has been practicing not taking up too much space, and is beginning, carefully, to practice stopping. At the man who had said cold in the dark, and then her name, and then 38 months of what he had been carrying, and who had asked her about the garden, because he had wanted to hear her voice without worry in it. This way, she said. They walked across the compound in the gold light, and the pack watched them pass, and the bond between them was load-bearing and settled and entirely theirs. And behind them the east wing door stood unbolted for the first time in 38 months, open to the autumn air, the chain of its locks hanging loose, and the room inside, holding nothing but the stone bench and the flat stones and one gray shawl, waiting for no one.